On Christmas Eve, a wealthy and lonely man trades the luxury of his mansion for the cold of the streets. Unknowingly, he encounters a child forgotten by the world, but full of light. She welcomes him with her heart, and he answers with the most valuable thing he has, his attention. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. The December snow fell silently over Westbrook Heights, blanketing the pristine streets of Boston's most exclusive neighborhood in a soft white cover. Christmas Eve lights twinkled from every mansion along Beacon Avenue, all except one. At the end of the street, partially hidden behind wrought iron gates and bare oak trees, stood Harrison Manor, a magnificent three-story Victorian mansion that remained mostly dark, save for a single window on the second floor. Inside that dimly lit room, Richard Blackwood stood motionless by the window, watching snowflakes dissolve against the glass. At 52, he was one of Boston's wealthiest investment bankers, with a fortune that had doubled during the last financial crisis. His salt-and-pepper hair and tailored suits had graced the covers of financial magazines, and his name appeared regularly on lists of America's most eligible bachelors. Yet behind the carefully crafted public image was a man consumed by an emptiness no amount of money could fill. "Will that be all for tonight, Mr. Blackwood?" Henderson, his butler of 15 years, stood at the doorway, his posture impeccable despite the late hour. Richard didn't turn. "Yes, Henderson, you can go home to your family now." "Are you certain, sir? It's Christmas Eve, and I'd be happy to—" "I said that will be all." Richard's tone wasn't harsh, just final. "Enjoy your holiday. I'll see you on the 27th. Catris Gwen." The butler's footsteps faded. Richard moved to his mahogany desk and opened the bottom drawer. From beneath financial statements and legal documents, he pulled out a tarnished silver frame, holding a photograph of a woman with auburn hair and a young girl with the same warm smile. Sarah and Lily, his wife and daughter, gone for 5 years. Now since that terrible night, when a blizzard had turned the mountain roads treacherous. Every Christmas since then had been unbearable. The mansion, once filled with laughter and music, now echoed with silence. The decorations remained boxed in the attic. The massive dining table hadn't hosted a Christmas dinner in years. The only tradition Richard maintained was his annual donation to children's charities. Substantial checks signed and mailed by his assistant, without him ever meeting the recipients. Tonight, however, something was different. The walls of Harrison Manor, always imposing, now felt suffocating. The silence was no longer just painful, it had become intolerable. Richard moved to his closet, pushing aside designer suits until he reached the very back, where he kept clothes he'd never worn, jeans with the tags still attached, flannel shirts purchased during a moment of aspirational outdoorsmanship, worn work boots bought for a gardening phase that never materialized. Richard changed quickly, removing his Patek Philippe watch and platinum cufflinks. He caught his reflection in the mirror and almost didn't recognize himself. Without the tailored suit and silk tie, he looked ordinary, approachable even. His face, usually composed for board meetings and financial presentations, now revealed the weariness that had settled deep into his features. He hadn't planned this. Not consciously anyway. But as he pulled on a worn wool cap and a jacket that had seen better days, Richard knew exactly what he needed. To disappear, if only for one night. To walk the streets not as Richard Blackwood, financial titan, but as nobody at all. Not seeking charity or attention, just seeking escape from the prison his success had built around him. The side door of the mansion closed quietly behind him. The security system, which would normally alert his phone, remained unarmed. For the first time in years, Richard Blackwood stepped into the night without a driver, without a destination, without the armor of wealth protecting him from the world. Boston. Streets transformed after dark. The financial district where he normally spent his days stood eerily quiet, its towers of glass and steel waiting for morning. Richard walked without direction, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. His expensive wool socks provided little warmth inside the never-broken-in work boots, and the wind bit through the jacket in a way his cashmere overcoats never allowed. After an hour of walking, Richard found himself in Riverdale, a neighborhood he knew only from charity reports and urban development proposals that had crossed his desk. The contrast to Westbrook Heights was stark. Here, Christmas decorations were sparse and mismatched, strings of multicolored lights hanging from fire escapes, plastic Santas with missing parts propped in windows. A group of teenagers eyed him suspiciously before continuing on their way. A woman clutched her purse tighter as she hurried past. Richard realized with a strange sense of wonder that in these clothes he had achieved his goal. He was invisible, just another middle-aged man down on his luck in a city that had plenty. Of them. The snow began falling more heavily, and Richard's feet, unused to such extensive walking, ached with each step. He spotted a small park and headed for a bench partially sheltered by bare maple trees. As he sat down, brushing snow from the wooden slats, the full weight of his solitude descended on him. Here, miles from his mansion, surrounded by lives so different from his own, the walls he'd built around his grief temporarily cracked. He buried his face in his gloved hands and allowed himself to feel the pain he'd been suppressing with work, with acquisitions, with the endless pursuit of more. "Are you okay, Mr. Asterisk?" The small voice startled him. Richard looked up to find a girl standing before him, no more than 8 or 9 years old. She wore a red knit hat pulled low over her ears, a coat too large for her frame, and boots held together with duct tape. Despite the cold and her obviously inadequate clothing, her expression showed more concern than discomfort. "I'm fine," he said quickly, embarrassed to be caught in a moment of weakness. "Just resting." Asterisk. The girl studied him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "You don't look fine, you look sad and cold." Asterisk. Richard straightened, instinctively reaching for the composure that served him in boardrooms. "Shouldn't you be home? It's late, and it's Christmas Eve." "I was getting firewood," she said, pointing to a small red wagon behind her, filled with broken branches and discarded lumber. "Our heater broke again." Asterisk. Richard frowned, parental concern surfacing despite himself. "Where are your parents?" Asterisk. The girl's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I don't have any, it's just me. My name's Abby, by the way. Abby Morgan." "You live alone?" Richard couldn't hide his disbelief. Asterisk. Abby shrugged as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "Not exactly alone. I have Mr. Whiskers." At Richard's confused expression, she added, "He's my cat." Asterisk. Before Richard could respond, Abby tilted her head and studied him more carefully. "I am not from around here, your hands are too soft, but you look hungry and nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve." She made this proclamation with the certainty only children can muster. "I'm making soup. It's just canned stuff, but I put extra carrots in it. You can come have some if you want." Asterisk. Richard opened his mouth to decline, to explain that he wasn't actually homeless, that he had a mansion waiting for him. But something in the girl's direct gaze stopped him. There was no pity there, no condescension, just a simple human connection he hadn't felt in years. "I'm Richard," he said finally. "Okay, Richard," Abby said, pulling her wagon behind her as she turned to go. "You coming or not? It's getting colder, and the soup's not getting any hotter sitting out here." Asterisk. Against every instinct of self-preservation and propriety, Richard Blackwood, who routinely declined invitations to dine at the White House, found himself rising from the bench to follow a child through the snowy streets of Riverdale, toward E. What? He couldn't begin to imagine. Asterisk. Abby led Richard through a maze of narrow streets, her small boots leaving shallow imprints in the fresh snow. The wagon creaked behind her, occasionally catching on uneven pavement. She navigated with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths countless times, turning at landmarks only she recognized. A crooked mailbox, a fence with missing planks, a tree with a peculiar bend. "It's not much farther," she assured him. Glancing back to make sure he was still following. Asterisk. Richard walked in silent bewilderment. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built his financial empire, screamed warnings about following a strange child to an unknown location. Yet another part, long dormant, compelled him forward. There was something about Abby. That felt familiar, though he couldn't place what ... They turned onto Sycamore Lane, where the houses stood close together, their foundations sinking unevenly into the ground. Christmas decorations were sparse here. An occasional wreath, a string of lights with half the bulbs burned out. At the end of the street, partially hidden behind an ancient oak tree, stood a small wooden structure that appeared to have been cobbled together from various materials over time. "That's my house," Abby announced with unmistakable pride. Richard stared. He would have called it a shed rather than a house. The walls were weathered wood planks of varying sizes, the roof a patchwork of corrugated metal and asphalt shingles. A makeshift chimney puffed thin smoke into the night sky. The windows were mismatched. One appeared to be from an old car, another covered with plastic sheeting. Beside the front door, which was painted a cheerful but chipping red, sat a collection of potted plants protected from the snow by a clear tarp. "You live here by yourself?" Richard couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Abby nodded, dragging her wagon to the side of the house. "Mrs. Wilson from 2 streets over checks on me sometimes, and Mr. Peterson gives me odd jobs at his store." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if her situation were completely normal. "Can you help me carry this wood inside?" Richard mechanically gathered an armful of scrapwood, his mind racing. How was this possible? A child living alone in what amounted to a glorified garden shed. Where were social services? How had no one reported this? The interior of Abby's home was even more startling than its exterior. The entire space couldn't have been more than 400 square feet, divided roughly into 3 areas. A small kitchen area consisted of a camping stove atop a wooden crate, a cooler that served as a refrigerator, and plastic bins that apparently functioned as cupboards. The living area held a threadbare sofa that doubled as Abby's bed, a milk crate turned upside down to serve as a coffee table, and a small wood-burning stove that provided the only heat. The third space, separated by a hanging blanket, presumably contained a makeshift bathroom. Despite the poverty evident in every corner, the place was meticulously clean and organized. Books were stacked neatly beside the sofa. The few dishes Abby owned were washed and arranged on a drying rack. On the wall hung childish drawings, carefully framed with popsicle sticks, painted gold. A large orange tabby cat emerged from behind the blanket divider, regarding Richard with suspicious yellow eyes. "That's Mr. Whiskers," Abby said, removing her hat and coat. Her light brown hair fell in an uneven bob around her face. "He doesn't like strangers much, but he'll warm up to you." Richard stood frozen just inside the door, the scrap wood still in his arms, overwhelmed by the contrast between this child's reality and his own. The entire house could fit inside his master bathroom. "You can put that by the stove," Abby instructed, moving to the kitchen area where a pot already simmered. "Sorry, it's not very warm in here yet. The stove takes a while to heat up." Richard placed the wood where directed, noticing how Abby had arranged the existing logs to maximize their burning efficiency. It was the kind of resourcefulness born of necessity. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to the sofa. "Soup's almost ready." Richard perched uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa, noting the springs that poked through the worn fabric. On the milk crate table sat a small Christmas tree made from green construction paper, decorated with buttons and bits of colored string. Beside it was a single wrapped present newspaper tied with twine, with "To Abby, from Abby," written, thin, careful block letters. "You wrapped a present for yourself?" Richard asked, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. Abby stirred the soup, her back to him. "It's tradition. This way, I still get to unwrap something on Christmas morning." She said it simply, without self-pity. Richard watched as she efficiently prepared their meal, standing on a wooden box to reach the camping stove. She ladled soup into 2 mismatched bowls and cut what appeared to be the last of a loaf of bread into careful slices. "It's not fancy," she said, bringing him a bowl and spoon, "but it's hot." Richard accepted the soup, a simple vegetable broth with carrots, potatoes, and what might have been canned chicken. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have considered it edible, Tonight it smelled like the most wonderful thing in the world. "Thank you," he said, meaning it more sincerely than any thanks he'd given in years. Asterisk. Abby sat cross-legged on the floor, balancing her bowl on her knees. "So, why were you sitting alone in the park on Christmas Eve?" she asked, blowing on a spoonful of soup. Asterisk. Richard hesitated. "I needed to get away." "From what?" Asterisk. Such a simple question, yet so complicated. "From my life, I suppose." Asterisk. Abby nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Sometimes I pretend I'm someone else too, someone with a big family who lives in a real house. On really cold nights I imagine I'm actually a princess, and this is just a test I have to pass before I can go back to my castle." Richard's chest tightened. "How long have you been living here, Abby?" Asterisk. She considered this, counting on her fingers. "Almost 2 years now. Before that I was at Horizon's group home, but I ran away. They weren't very nice there." "And before the group home?" Abby's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "I don't remember much before that. There was a lady who sang songs about stars. I think she might have been my mom, but maybe I just dreamed that part." She shrugged. "The social workers said my mom couldn't take care of me anymore, and nobody knew who my dad was." Asterisk. Richard struggled to comprehend how a child could speak so matter-of-factly about such profound abandonment. "But how do you survive here? How do you eat? Go to school?" "I'm really good at finding things people throw away that are still good," Abby explained. "And I help Mrs. Wilson with her garden, so she gives me vegetables. Mr. Peterson lets me stack shelves at his store on Saturdays. I used to go to Riverdale Elementary, but they kept asking for parent-teacher meetings, so I stopped going." She took another spoonful of soup. "I teach myself with library books now. The librarian, Miss Chambers, knows I live alone, but she pretends not to. She helps me find books about math and science." Asterisk. As Abby continued explaining her improvised life, Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions: horror at her circumstances, admiration for her resilience, and burning shame at the contrast between her gratitude for simple soup and his own dissatisfaction amid unimaginable luxury. "Aren't you afraid, living here alone?" he asked finally. Asterisk. Abby considered this. "Sometimes, mostly on stormy nights. Or when I get sick." She glanced at him, her eyes suddenly vulnerable. "But being alone is better than being somewhere people hurt you." Asterisk. The implication hung in the air between them. Richard wanted to ask more, but couldn't bring himself to probe. The child's obvious trauma. "What about you?" Abby changed the subject. "Do you have a family?" Asterisk. Richard stared into his soup bowl. "I did once. My wife Sarah and my daughter Lily. They're not here anymore." "Did they go to heaven?" Abby asked quietly. Asterisk. Richard nodded, unable to speak. "I'm sorry," she said with such genuine empathy that Richard had to look away. "That must be really hard, especially at Christmas." "It is," he managed. Asterisk. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the wood stove and the occasional purr from Mr. Whiskers, who had decided Richard might be acceptable, after all, and settled nearby. "You can stay here tonight if you want," Abby offered suddenly. "It's cold outside and nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve. I have an extra blanket. It's small, but it's better than nothing." Asterisk. Richard looked at the child before him, a girl who had nothing, yet offered him everything she could. In his world of calculated transactions and strategic relationships, such unguarded generosity was so foreign, it left him speechless. "I'd like that," he found himself saying, against all logic and reason. "Thank you, Abby." Asterisk. She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her serious little face, and Richard felt something shift inside him, something he'd thought had died along with Sarah and Lily 5 years ago. Asterisk. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Riverdale, in a blanket of white that made everything, even Abby's cobbled-together house, look, just for one night like it belonged in a fairy tale. Asterisk. Richard couldn't sleep. He lay on the narrow strip of floor beside Abby's sofa, wrapped in a thin blanket that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and wood smoke. The child had insisted he take the better blanket, keeping the smaller, more worn one for herself. Now, she slept peacefully on the sofa above him, her breathing deep and even, one small hand dangling over the edge. ***. The wood stove's embers cast a faint orange glow across the room. Outside, the wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, creating a symphony of creaks and sighs. Mr. Whiskers had curled himself into a tight ball at Abby's feet, occasionally opening one yellow eye to check on the stranger in his domain. ***. Richard stared at the ceiling, where shadows danced in the dying firelight. His body ached from the hard floor, but it wasn't physical discomfort keeping him awake. It was the overwhelming reality of Abby's existence and the stark mirror it held up to his own. ***. How had he never noticed children like her before? Of course, intellectually, he knew there were homeless and neglected children. His charitable foundation donated millions to organizations addressing child poverty. But those had been abstractions, statistics in reports, problems to be solved. With money transferred from one account to another, he had never sat in a child's makeshift home, eating soup from her meager supplies, witnessing firsthand the quiet dignity with which she faced abandonment. ***. Abby shifted in her sleep, murmuring something indecipherable. Richard watched her face, peaceful in slumber, and felt a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since Lily. His daughter would have been 13 now. Would she have had Abby's resilience, her generosity of spirit? The comparison brought a fresh wave of grief, but different somehow from the isolated pain he'd nursed for years. This was grief connected to something larger than himself, to the unfairness of a world where some children had everything and others nothing, where a girl like Abby could fall through every crack in the system. ***. Around 3 in the morning, Abby began to shiver despite the blanket. Richard quietly rose and added more wood to the stove, carefully arranging the pieces as he'd observed her doing earlier. When the flames caught, sending new warmth through the tiny house, he felt an absurd sense of accomplishment. When was the last time he'd done something so fundamentally useful, with his own hands? He returned to his makeshift bed but found himself studying the structure around him. The walls had been insulated with cardboard and newspaper. The windows were sealed with plastic and duct tape to keep out drafts. In one corner, a bucket collected water dripping from the roof. The ingenuity was impressive, but the necessity behind it was heartbreaking. This wasn't a home, it was survival. ***. As dawn approached, Richard made a decision. He couldn't simply walk away and return to his mansion, leaving Abby to this existence. Whatever had led him to that park bench, chance, fate, or his own, subconscious seeking meaning. He couldn't ignore what he'd found. ***. The first grey light of Christmas morning filtered through the plastic-covered windows when Abby stirred. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, momentarily confused by the presence of a stranger in her home. Then recognition dawned, and she offered a sleepy smile. "Merry Christmas, Richard," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Merry Christmas, Abby," he replied, sitting up on his pallet of blankets. ***. She swung her legs over the side of the sofa and reached for her self-wrapped present. "Do you want to watch me open my gift?" Richard nodded, throat tight as she carefully untied the twine, preserving it for future use. Inside the newspaper wrapping was a small figurine, a porcelain ballerina with a chipped arm, obviously rescued. So from someone's trash. "She's beautiful," Abby breathed, turning the figurine to catch the morning light. "I found her last week, but I wrapped her up so I'd have a surprise today." Richard watched as she placed the damaged ballerina on her milk crate table with reverence, positioning it just so. The care she took with this discarded object, seeing beauty where others had seen only brokenness, made his chest ache. "I'm sorry I don't have a gift for you," he said. Abby looked genuinely surprised. "But you do. You stayed. Nobody's ever stayed for Christmas before." Her simple statement, delivered without self-pity, hit Richard with the force of a physical blow. He had to look away, blinking rapidly against the burning in his eyes. Abby, misinterpreting his emotion, quickly moved to practical matters. "Are you hungry? I have some oatmeal. We can make it special for Christmas by adding the last of my cinnamon. Asterisk Richard cleared his throat. That sounds perfect. But first, I'd like to tell you something, Abby. Asterisk. She tilted her head, instantly, alert to the change in his tone. I haven't been completely honest with you. I'm not actually homeless. Abby's expression didn't change, but her body tensed slightly. You're not? Asterisk. Richard shook his head. No. I have a home. A big one, actually. I just needed to get away from it last night. Oh. She processed this information, eyes darting briefly to the door as if calculating her escape route. Are you going to take me to the authorities? Because I won't go back to Horizons. I'll run away again. No, Richard said quickly. No, that's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you because... He paused, unsure how to express the turmoil of emotions he'd experienced through the night. Because I want to help you, Abby. Really help you. Not just with soup or a warm place for one night. Asterisk suspicion clouded her features. What kind of help? Asterisk. It was a fair question. In her short life, help had likely come with strings attached, with promises broken, with new pain disguised as solutions. I'm not entirely sure yet, Richard admitted, but I know I can't just walk away and pretend I never met you. What you've done here, surviving on your own, taking care of yourself, it's remarkable. But you shouldn't have to do it alone. Asterisk Abby studied him with those two old eyes. Are you rich? Asterisk. The directness of the question made Richard smile despite himself. Yes, very. And you have a big house with heat that works all the time? Yes, more rooms than I need, actually. Asterisk Abby considered this. Then why were you sad in the park, Asterisk? The question penetrated right to the heart of Richard's existence. Because having things, even lots of things, doesn't make you happy if you're alone. My house is full of stuff but empty of people. Asterisk Abby nodded slowly, understanding far beyond her years. Like how Mr. Peterson has that big TV but always comes to talk to me when I'm sweeping his store because his wife died and he misses having someone to talk to. Exactly like that, Richard said softly. Asterisk. Abby got up and moved to her kitchen area, pulling out a dented pot and a canister of oatmeal. So what happens now? She asked, her back to him as she measured water. I'm not sure, Richard said honestly. But I'd like to find out more about your situation. Why you're not in school, why social services isn't involved. There must be proper channels to help you. Asterisk Abby turned, her expression suddenly fierce. The proper channels are the ones that put me in Horizons where Miss Farber locked kids in the closet when they cried. The proper channels are the ones that moved me to 4 different foster homes in 8 months. I tried the proper channels, Richard. They hurt more than being alone. Asterisk. The vehemence in her voice stunned him. I'm sorry, Abby. I didn't know. Asterisk. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Nobody knows. Nobody wants to know. Asterisk. Richard rose from his makeshift bed and moved to the kitchen area, crouching down so they were at eye level. I want to know, Abby. I want to understand what happened to you, and I want to make it right. Not by sending you back into a system that failed you, but by finding a better way. Asterisk. She stirred the oatmeal, not meeting his eyes. Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me. Asterisk. It was the question Richard had been asking himself all night. Why this child? Why now? The answer came to him with sudden clarity. Because last night, when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose, you invited a stranger into your home and shared what little you had. That kind of goodness matters, Abby. It matters more than all the money in my bank accounts. Asterisk. She looked up then, searching his face for deception. Finding none, she gave a small nod. Okay, but if you're tricking me... I'm not, Richard promised. No tricks. Just breakfast for now, and then we'll figure out the next step together. Asterisk. They ate their Christmas oatmeal in thoughtful silence, Abby adding the promised pinch of cinnamon to each bowl with ceremonial precision. Mr. Whiskers weaved between them, finally accepting Richard enough to permit a tentative scratch behind the ears. Asterisk. As the morning light strengthened, revealing more clearly the precariousness of Abby's situation. The bucket now half full of roof drippings, the dangerously frayed electrical cord powering her single lamp, the mold creeping up one corner. Richard's resolve solidified. Whatever legal or bureaucratic hurdles stood in the way, he would find a path forward. For the first time in 5 years, he had something more important than his grief to focus on. "You know," Abby said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I always wondered what it would be like to have a real Christmas, with a tree and presents and stuff." Richard set down his empty bowl. "Would you like to find out?" Abby's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, would you like to come see my house?" "Today? Just a visit," he added quickly, seeing her uncertainty. "You can bring Mr. Whiskers. We could have a proper Christmas dinner. There's a fireplace that doesn't smoke and heat that works all the time." Abby's expression was a complex mixture of longing and fear. "Will I have to stay there?" "No," Richard assured her, "just a visit. I'll bring you back here tonight if that's what you want." She thought for a long moment, then asked, "Can I bring my ballerina?" Richard smiled. "Of course." "And my books?" "Absolutely." Abby nodded decisively. "Okay then, but just for today." As she gathered her few treasures. The chipped ballerina, 3 worn paperbacks, a smooth stone she'd found by the river. Richard watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He had no idea what legal complications awaited, what obstacles would arise, or even if Abby would trust him beyond this tenuous Christmas truce. But for the first time since losing his family, he felt a sense of purpose unfurling within him. Whatever happened next, Richard Blackwood would never be the same after the night he spent in Abby Morgan's makeshift home, learning what true wealth looked like through the eyes of a child who had nothing and everything. To give ... the taxi driver did a double take when Richard gave him the address in Westbrook Heights. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, taking in Richard's disheveled appearance, the little girl in mismatched clothes, and the cat carrier they'd hastily purchased from a convenience store. "You sure about that address, buddy?" the driver asked skeptically. "Quite sure," Richard replied, his voice slipping back into the authoritative tone he used in boardrooms. The driver raised his eyebrows but said nothing more. Abby pressed her face against the window as they traveled from Riverdale's cramped streets into progressively more affluent neighborhoods. Her eyes widened at the manicured lawns, the luxury cars in driveways, the elaborate Christmas displays. "People really live like this," she whispered. Richard nodded, seeing his world through her eyes. The excess, the conspicuous consumption, the casual display of wealth that he'd always taken for granted. "Some do." As they approached the wrought-iron gates of Harrison Manor, Abby's mouth fell open. "That's not a house," she said. "That's a castle." Richard smiled faintly as he punched in the security code. The gates swung open silently, and the taxi proceeded up the long curved driveway. Snow-covered topiaries lined the path, and the mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade imposing against the winter sky. "You actually live here?" Abby asked, clutching Mr. Whiskers' carrier tighter. "All by yourself?" "I do," Richard confirmed, feeling a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. "Well, Henderson, my butler, comes during the day, but he's off for the holidays." "What's a butler?" Abby asked, her vocabulary gaps revealing themselves. Before Richard could answer, the taxi stopped at the front entrance. Richard paid, the driver generously ignoring his curious stare, and led Abby up the marble steps to the massive oak doors. "Ready?" he asked, reaching for his keys. Abby nodded, though her expression suggested she was bracing herself for something overwhelming. When Richard pushed open the door and ushered her into the soaring entryway, she stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes traveling up to the crystal chandelier hanging from the 20-foot ceiling. "Oh," she breathed, the single syllable encompassing her amazement. Richard saw his home with new eyes as Abby took it in, the sweeping staircase, the antique furniture, the original artwork on the walls. What had always seemed merely tasteful and appropriate now struck him as ridiculously extravagant, "Let me show you around," he said, gently guiding her forward. "We can let Mr. Whiskers out in the kitchen. He might need some time to adjust." Asterisk. They moved through the house, Abby walking carefully as if afraid to touch anything. In the gourmet kitchen, Richard helped her set up a makeshift litter box for Mr. Whiskers, using supplies they'd purchased on the way. The cat emerged from the carrier, tail puffed in indignation, and immediately disappeared under a cabinet. "He'll come out when he's ready," Abby assured Richard. "He always does." Asterisk. Richard nodded, then gestured around the gleaming kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops. "Are you hungry? We could make something." Asterisk. Abby looked at the complex array of appliances with trepidation. "Do you know how to cook?" Asterisk. Richard paused, realizing he hadn't prepared a meal himself in years. "Not really," he admitted. "Usually Henderson or the chef handles that." "You have your own chef?" Abby asked incredulously. "For special occasions," Richard said, feeling increasingly self-conscious about his lifestyle. "But I'm sure we can figure something out together." Asterisk. They settled on making sandwiches, a task simple enough for Richard to manage. As Abby watched him pull ingredients from the stainless steel refrigerator, her practical nature asserted itself. "You have so much food," she observed. "Most of it will go bad before you can eat it." Asterisk. Richard looked at the fully stocked refrigerator with fresh eyes. "You're right. I never really thought about it." Asterisk. Abby accepted the sandwich he made her turkey with provolone on artisanal bread, a far cry from her usual meals, and took a careful bite. Her eyes widened at the taste, but she ate slowly, savoring each mouthful as if unsure when she'd eat again. "What do you do?" she asked between bites. "For work, I mean." "I'm an investment banker," Richard replied. Then, seeing her blank look, added, "I help people and companies manage their money." "You must be good at it," Abby said, glancing around the kitchen that was larger than her entire house. Asterisk. Richard smiled wryly. "I am, but I'm beginning to think I've forgotten some important things along the way." Asterisk. After lunch, Richard gave Abby a proper tour of the mansion. She walked through each room with a mixture of awe and caution, asking thoughtful questions about paintings and furniture, but never touching anything without permission. In the library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, she gasped audibly. "You have more books than the Riverdale Library," she said, her fingers hovering near the leather-bound volumes, but not quite touching them. "You can take any of them down," Richard encouraged her. "Books are meant to be read." Asterisk. Hesitantly, Abby selected a volume of illustrated fairy tales, handling it with reverence. "Could we read some of these later?" "Of course," Richard promised. Asterisk. As they continued through the house, Richard found himself sharing stories about different rooms and objects, the antique globe his grandfather had given him, the piano Sarah used to play, the window seat where Lily would read for hours. He realized with surprise that it didn't hurt to talk about his family. Something about Abby's genuine interest made the memories feel like treasures to be shared rather than wounds to be hidden. Asterisk. Eventually, they reached a closed door on the 3rd floor. Richard paused, his hand on the doorknob. "This was my daughter's room," he said quietly. "I haven't opened it in years." Asterisk. Abby looked up at him solemnly. "We don't have to go in." Asterisk. Richard took a deep breath. "No, I think it's time." He turned the knob and pushed the door open. Asterisk. Lily-S room was exactly as she'd left it, 5 years earlier. The pale blue walls, the canopy bed with its butterfly pattern, the bookshelf filled with her favorite stories. Sunlight streamed through the bay window, catching dust motes in its beam. The preservation was both beautiful and eerie, a shrine to a life interrupted. Asterisk. Abby stood quietly in the doorway, sensing the significance of the moment. "She liked butterflies," she observed softly. Asterisk. Richard nodded, unable to speak as he took in the details of the room. Lily's science fair ribbon pinned to a bulletin board, her collection of polished stones on the windowsill, the telescope pointing toward the stars. "How old was she?" Abby asked gently. 8, Richard managed. "Just about your age." Asterisk. Abby digested this information. What was her name? Lily Blackwood. That's a pretty name, Abby said. Then after a moment's hesitation, she added, I bet she was nice. She was, Richard confirmed, a sad smile forming. She would have liked you. Asterisk. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Richard closed the door softly. Let's see the rest of the house. Asterisk. By late afternoon, Abby had begun to relax somewhat, though she still moved through the mansion with careful precision. Mr. Whiskers had finally emerged from hiding and was cautiously exploring his new territory, keeping close to the walls. What should we do about Christmas dinner? Richard asked, realizing he had no provisions for a proper holiday meal. Abby considered this. We could order pizza, she suggested pragmatically. That's what Mrs. Wilson does when she doesn't feel like cooking. Richard laughed, the sound surprising him with its authenticity. We could, but it's Christmas. Let me see what's available. A few phone calls later, Richard had arranged for a local upscale restaurant to deliver a complete Christmas dinner for two. While they waited, he decided to address the situation more directly. Abby, he began as they sat in the living room, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your circumstances. Is that okay? She tensed slightly, but nodded. How did you end up living in that house by yourself? Surely someone must be looking for you. Abby fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Not really. I told you I ran away from Horizon's group home. They reported it, I guess, but nobody tried very hard to find me. I was just one of those kids nobody wants. The matter-of-fact way she said it made Richard's heart constrict. What about school? Records, medical records. I used to go to Riverdale Elementary, Abby explained, but when they started asking too many questions, I stopped. I told them I was moving to live with an aunt in Colorado. They gave me my records to take, but I just kept them. She paused. I haven't been to a doctor since Horizons. I got sick last winter. Really sick with a fever. But Mrs. Wilson gave me some medicine. I have my birth certificate somewhere, I think. The social worker gave it to me when I aged out of the infant center. Richard tried to process this information. Aged out? How old were you? 5, Abby said, as if this were normal. That's when they moved me to Horizons. And your parents? Do you know anything about them? Abby's expression shuttered slightly. My mom couldn't take care of me, that's what they told me. They said she was very young and had problems. I don't know who my dad is. Nobody does. I think. The clinical detachment with which she recounted her abandonment was perhaps the most heartbreaking part. Richard resisted the urge to pull her into a hug, sensing she wasn't ready for such familiarity. Abby, what you've been through isn't right. No child should have to fend for themselves like you've had to. She shrugged. Lots of kids have it. Worse. That doesn't make it okay, Richard insisted gently. You deserve better, every child does. Before Abby could respond, the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of their Christmas dinner. Richard answered the door, tipping the delivery person generously, and brought the elaborate meal to the dining room. Abby quote's eyes widened at the sight of the feast roast turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, and a chocolate. You'll log for dessert. For a moment she looked overwhelmed by the abundance. We can't possibly eat all this, she said, surveying the spread. We'll save the leftovers, Richard assured her. Food should never go to waste. As they ate in the formal dining room, Richard couldn't help but notice how carefully Abby handled the fine china and crystal, how she took small portions despite her obvious hunger, how she seemed to be memorizing every detail of the experience. What are you thinking? He asked when she grew quiet. Abby looked up from her plate. I'm thinking this is like a dream and I'll wake up tomorrow back in my house with the leaky roof. Richard met her gaze steadily. It doesn't have to be that way, Abby. If you'd let me, I'd like to help you find a better situation. You mean like a new foster home? Her voice took on an edge of wariness. Not necessarily, Richard said carefully. I mean a permanent solution, a real home with people who care about you. Asterisk Abby set down her fork. People like who? Asterisk Richard took a deep breath, the idea that had been forming since dawn finally crystallizing into words. Maybe. People like me. Asterisk Abby stared at him, her expression unreadable. You don't even know me. I'd like to, Richard said simply. I think we might be able to help each other. Asterisk. She studied him with those old soul eyes. Because I remind you of Lily. Asterisk. The question, so direct and perceptive, caught Richard off guard. Partly, he admitted, respecting her too much to lie, but also because you're you, Abby, you're extraordinary in your own right. Asterisk. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. After helping Richard clear the dishes, Abby asked if they could read from the book of fairy tales she'd selected earlier. They settled in the library, Abby curled in a leather armchair, Mr. Whiskers finally comfortable enough to sit in her lap. Richard read aloud, watching her face light up at the stories of transformation and second chances. Asterisk. As evening fell and the mansion grew dark except for the lamps they'd lit, Richard faced the question he'd been avoiding all day. It's getting late, he said, closing the book. What would you like to do, Abby? I promised I'd take you back if that's what you wanted. Asterisk Abby stroked Mr. Whiskers, her face pensive. Could I maybe stay just tonight? It's still Christmas and it's warm here. She quickly added, I don't mean forever, just tonight. Asterisk relief flooded through Richard. It was a small beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. Of course you can stay, there are plenty of guest rooms, or... He hesitated. Or you could use Lily's room if you'd like. Asterisk Abby considered this seriously. I think maybe a guest room would be better. For now. Asterisk Richard nodded, understanding her caution. For now. Asterisk. As he showed her to a guest suite and helped her settle in with Mr. Whiskers, Richard knew the coming days would bring complicated questions and difficult decisions. There would be legal hurdles, emotional barriers, and the practical challenges of building trust with a child who had learned the hard way not to depend on adults. Asterisk. But watching Abby explore the guest room with cautious wonder, Richard felt more certain than he had in years. Somehow, against all odds, on a snowy Christmas Eve, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever, a purpose beyond himself, and the courage to open his heart again, whatever the risks might bring. Asterisk. The day after Christmas dawned clear, and bright sunlight reflecting off the snow-covered grounds of Harrison Manor. Richard woke early, momentarily disoriented before remembering the extraordinary events of the previous day. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, half expecting to find the house empty, Abby having decided during the night that this strange new situation was too much. Asterisk. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, standing on a step stool she'd discovered, somewhere attempting to make breakfast. Mr. Whiskers watched from atop the refrigerator, his new favorite perch. Good morning, Richard said, trying to keep the relief from his voice. Asterisk. Abby turned, a spatula in hand. I hope it's okay that I'm using your kitchen. I wanted to thank you for letting us stay. Of course it's okay, Richard assured her, moving closer to see what she was cooking. But you didn't need to make breakfast. I always make my own food, she said matter-of-factly, flipping what appeared to be a slightly misshapen pancake. Mrs. Wilson taught me how. Asterisk Richard watched as she competently managed the stove, mixing batter and adjusting heat with the confidence of someone who had been cooking for years. It struck him as both impressive and profoundly sad that a child her age had such self-sufficiency, out of necessity rather than choice. Those smell delicious, he said truthfully. Asterisk. Abby smiled, a quick flash that transformed her serious face. There's coffee in the pot. I don't drink it, but I know grown-ups need it in the morning. Asterisk Richard poured himself a cup, touched by her thoughtfulness. What would you like to do today? Asterisk Abby slid the pancake onto a plate and poured more batter into the pan. I should probably go back to my house. Mr. Peterson is expecting me to sweep his store tomorrow, and I need to check if the roof leaked more with all the snow. Asterisk. The casual way she outlined her adult responsibilities made Richard's chest tighten. What if I told you that you don't have to worry about those things anymore? Asterisk Abby gave him a skeptical look. Everybody has to worry about something. Yes, but children shouldn't have to worry about leaky roofs and jobs. They should be in school playing with friends, reading books. He trailed off, seeing the wariness return to her expression. I like my life, she said defensively. I take care of myself just fine. Richard nodded, realizing he'd pushed too hard too soon. I know you do, Abby. You're remarkably capable. I just think you deserve to be a child too. She turned back to the stove, focusing intently on the pancake. What happens when you get tired of having me around, or when you decide I'm too much trouble? The question caught Richard off guard with its directness. Is that what you're worried about? Abby shrugged, not looking at him. It's what always happens. Richard set down his coffee cup and moved to stand beside her, careful to give her space. Abby, look at me. When she reluctantly met his gaze, he continued, I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but I can promise that I won't abandon you. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. She studied his face, searching for deception. You mean that now? But people change their minds. Some do, Richard acknowledged, but I'd like the chance to prove I'm different. Abby considered this as she plated the final pancake. I guess we could try for a little while. It wasn't enthusiastic endorsement, but it was enough for now. Richard helped her carry breakfast to the table, and they ate in companionable. Silence. After breakfast, Richard made several phone calls from his study while Abby explored the library further. The first was to his attorney, Jonathan Wells. Jonathan, I need your help with a sensitive matter, Richard explained once pleasantries were exchanged. Of course, Richard. What can I do for you? Richard took a deep breath. I've encountered a child in an extremely concerning situation. She's essentially homeless, living alone in deplorable conditions with no adult supervision whatsoever. There was a pause on the line. Have you contacted Child Services? Not yet. The situation is complicated. She ran away from a group home where she was mistreated. She's deeply distrustful of the system, and frankly, based on what she's told me, I share her concerns. Richard, Jonathan's voice held a note of caution. Whatever the circumstances, you need to report this to the proper authorities. I will, Richard assured him. But I want to be certain she doesn't end up back in the same situation. I want to explore options for providing her with a stable home. Another pause. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying, I want to know what would be involved in becoming her guardian, possibly adopting her eventually. Jonathan's surprise was audible. That's unexpected. Richard, these processes are complicated and lengthy. There are home studies, background checks, training requirements. I understand, Richard interrupted, and I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary. But I need your help navigating the system in a way that ensures her well-being remains the priority. May I ask what prompted this sudden interest in becoming a guardian? Richard glanced toward the library, where he could hear Abby turning pages. Let's just say I've recently been reminded of what's truly important in life. After finishing his call with Jonathan, who agreed to research the situation and prepare the necessary documentation, Richard contacted Henderson to inform him he'd be returning early from his holiday. Then, steeling himself, he made the most difficult call to Mariana Reynolds, the director of his charitable foundation. Mariana, I need information about a group home called Horizons. It's here in Boston. Horizons? Mariana repeated. I believe they're one of the facilities that receive funding through the State Child Welfare Grant Program. Is there a particular reason you're asking? I have concerns about their treatment of children in their care, Richard said carefully. Specifically, allegations of abuse and neglect. That's serious, Mariana said, her tone sharpening. I can pull their records and see what we know. We've been pushing for greater accountability in the foster care system for years, as you know. I do, and I think it's time we made it a priority. Richard hesitated, then added, I've encountered a child who fell through the cracks of that system. I want to understand how that happened, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen to others. By early afternoon, Richard had set in motion a series of inquiries and, Legal processes that would, he hoped, provide a framework for Abby's future. When he joined her in the library, he found her deeply engrossed in an illustrated encyclopedia of animals. "Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts?" she asked without looking up. "I didn't," Richard admitted, sitting across from her. "That's fascinating. And they're really smart. They can solve puzzles and escape from tanks." She traced a picture of an octopus with her finger. "I read about them at the library once, but this book has better pictures." Richard watched her for a moment, struck by the natural curiosity that had somehow survived despite her circumstances. "Abby, I need to talk to you about something important." She closed the book reluctantly, instantly alert to his serious tone. "I've been speaking with some people who can help us figure out your situation. My lawyer, for one." Abby's body tensed. "Am I in trouble?" "No, absolutely not," Richard assured her quickly. "But legally you can't continue living alone. It's not safe and it's not right." Her expression closed off. "So you are sending me back?" "No," Richard said firmly. "I'm trying to find a way for you to stay with me. Legally." Surprise flickered across her face. "With you here?" Richard nodded. "If that's what you want. But it's not as simple as just deciding. There are procedures we need to follow, people who will need to make sure I'm qualified to take care of you." Abby processed this information, her brow furrowed. "What about Horizons?" "They'll try to make me go back." "I'm looking into Horizons, too," Richard said. "If what you've told me about how they treated children is true, they shouldn't be caring for anyone." Abby's eyes widened. "You believe me? About Miss Farber and the closet?" "Of course I believe you," Richard said gently. "And I'm going to make sure other people believe you too." She was quiet for a long moment. "What happens next?" "Well, first, my butler Henderson will be returning tomorrow. He's a good man, and I trust him completely. Then, in the next few days, we'll need to meet with some officials from Child Services. My lawyer will be with us to make sure everything is handled properly." "Will they take me away while they decide?" Abby asked, the fear evident in her voice despite her attempt to appear brave. Richard wished he could promise they wouldn't, but he wouldn't lie to her. "I don't know yet, but I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe." Abby nodded slowly, absorbing the uncertainty of her situation. Then in a small voice she asked, "Why are you doing this, really?" It was a fair question, one Richard had been asking himself since Christmas Eve. "When I met you, Abby, I was lost. I had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. You reminded me what it means to care about someone else more than yourself." "Because of Lily," she persisted. "Partly," Richard acknowledged. "Losing Lily and Sarah broke something in me. Meeting you didn't fix it, but it helped me see that I could still make a difference in someone's life. In your life, if you'll let me." Abby considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "I'm not Lily," she said finally. "I can't replace her." "I know that," Richard said, emotion thickening his voice. "I would never want you to try. You're Abby, and that's exactly who you should be." She seemed satisfied with this answer. "Can we still go check on my house? I have things there, important things." "Of course, we can go this afternoon." Later, as they drove to Riverdale in Richard's rarely used Audi, Abby sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the neighborhoods change from affluent to struggling. Richard could sense her anxiety growing as they approached her makeshift home. The little wooden structure looked even more precarious in daylight than it had on Christmas Eve. The snow on the roof had partially melted and refrozen, creating dangerous ice dams. One window was cracked, the plastic covering torn. "Home sweet home," Abby murmured as they parked. Inside, the cold was penetrating. Without Abby's constant attention to the wood stove, the temperature had plummeted. Water had indeed leaked through the roof, creating a puddle on the floor that had begun to freeze. Mr. Whisker's empty food bowl sat untouched by the door. Richard watched as Abby moved efficiently through the space, gathering her meager belongings. The few clothes she owned, her precious books, a small wooden box with what he presumed were keepsakes. She worked methodically, without sentimentality, like someone accustomed to packing quickly. "Is there anything else you need?" Richard asked when she'd finished, her possessions filling barely half a cardboard box they'd brought. Abby looked around the tiny house one last time. "No, this is everything." As they were leaving, an elderly woman approached from a nearby house, eyeing Richard suspiciously. "Abby, is everything all right?" she called. "Hi, Mrs. Wilson," Abby replied. "This is my friend Richard. I'm going to stay with him for a while." Mrs. Wilson's eyes narrowed as she assessed Richard. "Is that so? And who might you be in relation to our Abby?" Richard appreciated the woman's protectiveness. "I'm a friend who's concerned about Abby living alone, especially during winter." "We all been concerned," Mrs. Wilson retorted. "But concern don't keep a child warm, does it? Some of us at least brought her food and checked on her, instead of letting her fend for herself." "You're right," Richard said, accepting the rebuke. "The system failed her. I'm trying to make that right." Mrs. Wilson sniffed, unconvinced. "Abby, you come to me if you need anything, you hear? My door's always open to you." "I know, Mrs. Wilson, thank you for everything." Abby's voice held genuine affection. As they drove back to Harrison Manor, Richard reflected on the encounter. "Mrs. Wilson cares about you." "She does," Abby agreed. "She taught me to cook and helped me when I was sick. But she's old and has bad arthritis. She couldn't take me in even if she wanted to." "There were others who helped you too?" Richard asked. Abby nodded. "Mr. Peterson gave me odd jobs. Miss Chambers at the library let me stay late and sometimes forgot to check if I had a parent with me. Mr. Guzman at the bodega gave me food that was about to expire." She paused. "People are mostly good, I think. They just don't always know what to do." The simple wisdom in her observation struck Richard deeply. How many times had he himself turned away from direct engagement with suffering, preferring to write checks rather than face human need? How many Abbeys had he passed on the street without seeing? When they returned to the mansion, Henderson had already arrived, his face registering carefully concealed surprise at the sight of Abby. "Henderson, this is Abby Morgan," Richard introduced them. "She'll be staying with us for the foreseeable future." "Very good, sir." Henderson's professional demeanor never wavered, though his eyes held questions. "Will Miss Morgan be occupying the blue guest suite?" "For now, yes." Richard turned to Abby. "Henderson keeps this place running. If you need anything at all, he can help you." Abby regarded the butler with solemn curiosity. "Do you live here too?" "I have an apartment over the garage, miss," Henderson replied. "I'm here during the day and on call for emergencies." "Oh," Abby processed this information. "I've never met a butler before. Do you like it?" A ghost of a smile touched Henderson's lips. "I find it most satisfactory, Miss Morgan. Perhaps you would like to see where your things will be unpacked." As Henderson led Abby upstairs with her box of belongings, Richard retreated to his study. The reality of what he was undertaking was beginning to sink in. His life of carefully maintained isolation was over. Whatever happened next, whether the legal system allowed him to become Abby's guardian or not, he could never return to the emotional numbness that had defined his existence for the past 5 years. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Richard picked up a framed photo of Sarah that sat on his desk, tracing her smiling face with his finger. "I think you'd approve," he whispered to the image of his late wife. "She needs me, and I think I need her too." Later that evening, as Richard and Abby ate dinner prepared by Henderson, she asked suddenly, "What if they don't let me stay with you?" Richard set down his fork, meeting her anxious gaze. "Then we'll appeal, and if that doesn't work, we'll find another solution. But I promise you this, Abby, no matter what happens, you will never have to face the world alone again." For the first time since he'd met her, Abby's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "I'd like to believe that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then believe it, Richard replied simply. Some promises are worth keeping, and this is one of them. Asterisk, that night, as Richard passed the blue guest suite on his way to bed, he heard a soft sound from within. Pausing, he realized Abby was reading aloud to Mr. Whiskers from one of the library books. The ordinary domesticity of the moment, a child reading a bedtime story with her pet, struck him with unexpected force. This was what had been missing. From Harrison Manor, not just the presence of another person, but the small everyday moments that transformed a house into a home. Asterisk. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Richard knew with sudden certainty that he would face them all for the chance to hear that sound again. The simple, profound evidence of a child feeling safe enough to be a child. Asterisk. The following weeks unfolded. In a whirlwind of legal meetings, official interviews, and cautious adjustments, as Richard and Abby attempted to navigate both the bureaucracy of the child welfare system and their evolving relationship. January arrived with record-breaking cold, making Richard profoundly grateful that Abby was no longer in her precarious wooden shelter. Asterisk. The first meeting with Child Protective Services had been tense. Miss Winters, a veteran social worker with tired eyes and a skeptical demeanor, had questioned them separately. Richard's attorney, Jonathan, had prepared him thoroughly, but nothing could have readied him for the emotional impact of watching Abby disappear into a conference room with a stranger who held her future in her hands. "Why this child, Mr. Blackwood?" Miss Winters had asked him directly. "With your resources, you could help dozens of children through established channels. Why are you so fixated on this particular girl?" Asterisk. Richard had struggled to articulate the connection he felt to Abby without sounding irrational or worse, suspicious. "I can't explain it except to say that when she invited me into her home and shared what little she had, something changed in me. Call it fate or coincidence or divine intervention, but I believe we were meant to help each other heal." Asterisk. Ms. Winters had made a non-committal note. "And you understand that fostering, let alone adoption, is not like purchasing a company. You can't simply decide you want something and make it happen through financial leverage or connections." Asterisk. The implied accusation had stung, but Richard had recognized the woman was doing her job, protecting a vulnerable child from potentially harmful motives. "I understand completely," he'd replied. "And I welcome every evaluation and scrutiny you deem necessary. Abby's well-being is my only concern." Asterisk. Now, 3 weeks later, they had achieved a tenuous victory. Richard had been granted temporary emergency guardianship, while a more thorough home study and background investigation proceeded. Abby would stay with him, with weekly visits from Miss Winters and mandatory counseling sessions for both of them. Asterisk. It was progress, but the road ahead remained uncertain. The system moved glacially, and each step forward seemed to reveal new complications. "The Horizons Group home is fighting back," Jonathan informed Richard during a phone call on a particularly frigid January morning. "They're claiming Abby was never officially discharged, that she's a runaway, and that they retain legal responsibility for her." Asterisk. Richard gripped the phone tighter. "That's absurd. She lived on her own for nearly 2 years, and they never bothered to find her. She was less than 3 miles from their facility." "They're claiming they filed reports and conducted searches," Jonathan replied, his tone suggesting skepticism. "But more concerning is that they've enlisted support from a judge, Matthews, who's known for favoring institutional placement over individual fostering, especially by single parents." Asterisk. Richard paced his study, glancing out the window where Abby was building a snow fort in the backyard, bundled in new winter clothing, with Henderson dutifully assisting by carrying large snowballs at her direction. "What's their motivation? Why fight for a child they clearly neglected?" Asterisk. Jonathan sighed. "Money, most likely. Each child represents state and federal funding. Plus, your involvement has brought scrutiny to their operation. The allegations Abby made about their treatment of children are damaging. They may be trying to discredit her by painting her as troubled and unreliable." "She is neither of those things," Richard said firmly. "I know that. But we need more than your word and hers. We need corroboration from other children." Documentation of neglect, witnesses to the conditions she described. Asterisk Richard watched as Abby showed Henderson how to properly pack snow for the fort's walls. In the short time she'd been at Harrison Manor, she'd begun to show glimpses of the child beneath the self-sufficient survivor, laughing more freely, asking questions, expressing preferences. Yet she still maintained a careful vigilance, as if waiting for everything to be snatched away. "Find whatever we need," Richard instructed Jonathan. "Use whatever resources necessary. I won't let them take her back to that place." Asterisk inside the mansion, changes were unfolding in ways both dramatic and subtle. The blue guest suite had been transformed with Abby's input into a proper bedroom for a child, though one who had never had such luxuries before. She'd selected the paint color, a soft sage green, and bedding patterned with stars and moons, but had been overwhelmed by the concept of decorating. The idea that she could have things simply because they brought her joy was foreign to her practical nature. "But what's it for?" she'd asked, perplexed when Richard suggested she might want artwork for her walls or decorative pillows for her bed. "It's not for anything," Richard had tried to explain. "It's just to make the space feel like yours, to make it beautiful or comfortable in ways you enjoy." Asterisk Abby had considered this novel concept carefully before finally selecting a detailed map of the world for one wall, "So I can learn about places," and a telescope similar to the one that had been in Lily's room, "to see the stars better from my window." Henderson, initially formal and reserved with Abby, had gradually become her ally and teacher. He showed her how to properly set a table, explained the functions of the mansion's many rooms, and never betrayed a hint of judgment about her gaps in knowledge or occasional social awkwardness. "Miss Morgan has requested cooking lessons," he informed Richard one evening. "She insists she already knows the basics, but wishes to expand her repertoire beyond, as she put it, survival food." Asterisk Richard smiled at the butler's perfect imitation of Abby's matter-of-fact tone. "And you agreed?" "I took the liberty of scheduling Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the kitchen, sir. Miss Morgan is a remarkably quick study." Asterisk more challenging was the matter of Abby's education. After extensive testing revealed a patchwork of knowledge, advanced reading skills, alongside significant gaps in mathematics and science, Richard had hired a private tutor, Miss Perez, to work with her daily while they determined the best school placement for the following year. "She's extraordinarily bright," Miss Perez reported after their first week, "but she's never had consistent instruction or encouragement. She's learned to be resourceful rather than thorough, and she's afraid of appearing ignorant." "What do you recommend?" Richard asked. "Patience and consistency. She needs to trust that asking questions won't be held against her, that not knowing something isn't a failure but an opportunity." Asterisk. This insight extended beyond academics. In every aspect of their developing relationship, Richard was learning that Abby's trust could not be purchased with material things or demanded as a right. It had to be earned through reliability, through promises kept, through the daily demonstration that her needs and feelings mattered. Asterisk. The counseling sessions mandated by the court were proving valuable, if sometimes painful. Dr. Lambert, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, met with Abby twice weekly and with Richard once. Their joint sessions often left Richard emotionally drained, but more committed than ever to providing Abby the stability she desperately needed. "She's afraid to fully attach to you," Dr. Lambert explained during one of their private sessions. "Not because of anything you've done wrong, but because her experience has taught her that attachments lead to abandonment and pain. The more she cares about you, the more vulnerable she feels." "How do I help her overcome that?" Richard asked. "Time," Dr. Lambert said simply. "Consistent, reliable presence, and understanding that healing isn't linear. There will be setbacks, testing behaviors, moments when she pushes you away to see if you'll leave. Your job is to stay steady through all of it." Asterisk Richard was trying his best to follow this advice when Abby's nightmares began. The first time he'd been awakened by Henderson at 2 in the morning. "Sir, Miss Morgan appears to be in distress," the butler had reported, concern evident beneath his professional demeanor. Asterisk Richard had found Abby thrashing in her bed, crying out for someone to, "Please don't lock the door." When he gently woke her, she'd been disoriented, clutching at his arm with surprising strength. "You're safe," he'd assured her, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You're at Harrison Manor. No one is going to lock you in anywhere." Abby had nodded, still half in the nightmare's grip. Miss Farber used to put kids in the supply closet if they cried at night, sometimes for hours. It was dark and there were chemicals that burned your nose. Richard had felt a surge of rage at the woman who had traumatized children in her care, followed by renewed determination to ensure Horizons was investigated thoroughly. "That will never happen to you again," he promised, "and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to any other children either." The nightmares continued intermittently, joined by other signs of the trauma Abby had endured: an extreme startle response to loud noises, anxiety about food running out, hoarding small items in her room as if preparing for sudden departure. Through it all, Richard maintained the steady presence Dr. Lambert had advised, neither pushing Abby to discuss her fears nor dismissing them as unfounded. Slowly, incrementally, she began to relax her vigilance, to trust that Harrison Manor was truly becoming her home. On a snowy February afternoon, Richard received an unexpected call from Mariana Reynolds at his foundation. "We found something," she said without preamble, "about Horizons and Judge Matthews. You need to see this immediately." An hour later, Richard sat in his foundation's conference room, reviewing the documents Mariana had compiled. What emerged was a troubling pattern of financial irregularities, conflicts of interest, and suspicious placement decisions involving Horizons, Judge Matthews, and several other entities within the child welfare system. "They've been siphoning government funds meant for children's care for years," Mariana explained, pointing to highlighted figures in an audit report. "Reporting higher numbers of children than they actually house, charging for services never provided, placing children in substandard conditions while pocketing the difference." "And Matthews?" Richard asked, studying a photograph of the judge. "At a fundraising event with Horizons director. His brother-in-law sits on their board, and there's more. They've been channeling children into a network of affiliated services, all owned by the same parent company. The more children in the system, the more money they make." Richard felt cold fury building as he connected these revelations to Abby's experiences. "Can we prove it?" "We have financial records, whistleblower testimonies from former employees, and documented patterns of children mysteriously running away when they became too troublesome or asked too many questions." Mariana tapped a thick folder, including 3 others from Abby's time at Horizons, who also reported being locked in closets as punishment. Richard stood, decision made. "Take this to the State Attorney General's office, and to the press. All of it?" Mariana looked concerned. "Richard, this could complicate your guardianship case. If Matthews realizes you're behind the investigation—" "I don't care," Richard interrupted. "This isn't just about Abby anymore. How many other children are suffering in that place? How many have been denied proper homes because of this corruption? Use every resource we have." That evening, as Richard helped Abby with her science homework at the kitchen table, he found himself studying her with new perspective. The child who had first appeared to him as uniquely abandoned was, in fact, one of many victims of a broken system. The difference was that she had somehow found the courage and resourcefulness to escape it. "What?" Abby asked, noticing his thoughtful gaze. "I was just thinking about how brave you are," Richard said honestly. Abby looked embarrassed. "I'm not brave, I was just trying to survive." "That's exactly what bravery is sometimes," Richard told her. "Doing what you need to do even when you're afraid." Abby considered this, twirling her pencil between her fingers. "Are you afraid of anything?" The question caught Richard off guard with its directness. "Many things," he admitted. "I'm afraid of failing people who count on me. I'm afraid of losing those I care about. Like you lost Sarah and Lily?" "Yes." Abby was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you didn't let anyone get close to you for so long? Henderson told me you used to work all the time and never had people over. Asterisk. Richard smiled ruefully. Henderson has been sharing secrets, has he? He's just worried about you, Abby said seriously. He thinks you've been sad for too long. He's right, Richard acknowledged. I was trying to protect myself from being hurt again. Did it work? Abby asked, her perceptiveness cutting to the heart of the matter. No, Richard said softly. It just meant I was alone with my sadness instead of having anyone to share it with. Asterisk. Abby nodded, as if this confirmed a theory she'd been developing. That's why you let me stay, because being alone is worse than being scared of what might happen. That's part of it, Richard agreed, but it's also because you reminded me that there are things worth taking risks for, people worth opening your heart to, even if it means being vulnerable again. Asterisk. Abby absorbed this, then returned to her science worksheet with renewed concentration, the conversation apparently concluded from her perspective. But later, as Richard was saying goodnight, she spoke again. I'm scared. Too, you know, she admitted, sitting up in her bed surrounded by pillows that still seemed to overwhelm her small frame. Scared they'll make me go back, or that you'll change your mind. Asterisk. Richard sat on the edge of her bed. I know you are, and I wish I could promise that the first won't happen, but I can't control the legal system. What I can promise is that the second never will. I will not change my mind about you, Abby. Asterisk. She studied his face with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through pretense. What if I do something really bad? Like what? Richard asked. Asterisk. Abby shrugged. I don't know. What if I break something expensive? Or what if I get really angry and yell at you? Or what if I can't learn all the proper manners Henderson is teaching me? Asterisk. Richard heard the real question beneath these scenarios. Will your love be conditional? Will you discard me if I'm not perfect? Abby, he said gently, families aren't about perfection. They're about belonging to each other through good times and bad. Whatever happens, whatever mistakes either of us make, we'll work through it together. Promise? She whispered, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. I promise, Richard said, meaning it more than any vow he'd ever made. Asterisk. As he turned out the light and closed her door, leaving it open just a crack. The way she preferred, Richard was struck by how completely his life had transformed in the span of less than 2 months. The mansion that had once echoed with emptiness now resonated with purpose. The future that had stretched before him as an endless repetition of meaningless days now held challenge, uncertainty, and profound meaning. Asterisk. Whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever obstacles horizons and their corrupt allies might place in their path, Richard knew he would fight with every resource at his disposal. Not just for Abby, but for all the children trapped in a system that had failed its most fundamental purpose, to protect the vulnerable. Asterisk. Later that night, as Richard prepared for bed, his phone rang with a call from Jonathan. The Attorney General's office has opened an investigation into Horizons, his lawyer reported, and they've requested an emergency hearing regarding all current custody cases involving the facility, including Abby's. When? Richard asked, immediately alert. Tomorrow morning. Judge Matthews has been recused due to potential conflicts of interest. We'll be appearing before Judge Diane Collier instead. Is that good or bad for us? Jonathan's voice held cautious optimism. Potentially very good. Collier has a reputation for being thorough and child-centered in her decisions, and with the evidence your foundation has uncovered, Horizon's credibility is severely compromised. Asterisk. After. Ending the call, Richard stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds of Harrison Manor. Somewhere in the distance, city lights twinkled against the night sky. The same stars shone over Abby's former wooden shelter, now abandoned to the winter elements. Asterisk. What strange constellation of events had led them to each other? What cosmic alignment had placed him in that park on Christmas Eve and moved Abby to extend her hand to a stranger? Richard wasn't a religious man, but in that moment he felt a profound sense of something greater than coincidence at work in their lives. Asterisk. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The legal system would make its determinations. But whatever happened in that courtroom, Richard knew with absolute certainty that the real miracle had already occurred. Two broken people had found in each other the courage to begin again, to risk loving after loss, to believe in second chances when all evidence suggested they didn't exist. That Richard thought as he turned from the window was the true battle they'd already won. The Boston courthouse stood imposing against the winter sky, its granite facade dusted with fresh snow as Richard and Abby climbed the steps hand in hand. Jonathan waited for them at the entrance, his expression cautiously optimistic as he briefed them on last-minute developments. "The Attorney General's investigation has expanded," he explained in hushed tones as they walked toward the courtroom. 3 former Horizons employees came forward overnight with corroborating statements about the conditions there. Richard nodded, squeezing Abby's hand reassuringly. She was uncharacteristically quiet this morning, her usual composure replaced by a tense vigilance. She wore a new dress, simple but elegant, that Henderson had helped her select, and her hair had been neatly braided. To anyone observing, she looked like any well-cared-for child accompanying her father to an important appointment. But Richard could feel the slight tremor in her small hand, could see the way her eyes darted to each exit they passed, planning escape routes should things go wrong. Dr. Lambert had warned him this would be especially difficult for her. Returning to the system that had failed her, placing her fate in the hands of strangers once again. "Remember what we discussed," Richard murmured as they approached the courtroom doors. "No matter what happens today, we face it together." Abby nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. Inside. The courtroom was less intimidating than Richard had feared. Judge Collier, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes, had opted for a smaller chamber rather than the main courtroom. The proceedings felt more like a conference than a trial, with all parties seated around a large table rather than separated by the traditional barriers. Ms. Winters was present, along with her supervisor from Child Protective Services. Representatives from the Attorney General's office sat to one side, their expressions grim as they reviewed documents. Most concerning was the presence of Mr. Davis, Horizons director, and their legal counsel, both looking distinctly uncomfortable as whispered conversations swirled around them. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Collier entered. What followed was unlike any legal proceeding Richard had anticipated. Rather than formal arguments from opposing sides, Judge Collier established from the outset that her primary concern was Abby's welfare, not institutional prerogatives or procedural technicalities. "I've reviewed the case file thoroughly," she began, "including Miss Morgan's history in the system, the circumstances of her departure from Horizons, her subsequent period of unsupervised living, and her current placement with Mr. Blackwood." She turned directly to Abby. "But what I haven't heard enough of is your perspective, young lady." Abby straightened in her chair, clearly surprised to be addressed directly. "My perspective, Your Honor." "Yes. After all, this proceeding is about your life, not the convenience of the adults in this room." Judge Collier's tone was gentle but firm. "Would you be comfortable telling me about your experience at Horizons and why you chose to leave?" Richard felt a surge of admiration for the judge's approach, even as concern for Abby tightened his chest. They had prepared for many scenarios, but not for Abby to be put on the spot so directly. To his amazement, Abby rose to the occasion with remarkable poise. She described her time at Horizons without dramatics, but with unflinching honesty. The neglect, the punishments, the fear that permeated the facility. She detailed her escape and the makeshift life she'd created for herself, neither minimizing the hardships nor seeking pity. "I know living alone wasn't safe," she concluded, "but it felt safer than staying there." Mr. Davis shifted uncomfortably. As Abby spoke, his attorney scribbling notes with increasing agitation. When Abby mentioned specific incidents, being locked in closets, denied meals, witnessing younger children being similarly mistreated, the attorney attempted to object. "Your Honor, these are unsubstantiated allegations from a child with her history of behavioral problems. Asterisk Judge Collier fixed the lawyer with a stern gaze. Mr. Reynolds, this is not a criminal trial, and Miss Morgan is not on trial. I am interested in hearing her experiences without interruption. She turned back to Abby. Please continue. Asterisk. When Abby finished speaking, Judge Collier asked her about her time with Richard, how they met, what their daily life was like, how she felt in his home. He treats me like a person, Abby said simply. Not like a problem or a case number. And he keeps his promises. Asterisk Judge Collier nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Abby, that was very helpful. She then addressed the representatives from Child Protective Services. Miss Winters, I understand you've been conducting weekly visits at Mr. Blackwood's home. What are your observations? Asterisk Ms. Winters, whose initial skepticism about Richard had gradually evolved into cautious support, presented her findings. Mr. Blackwood has provided an exceptionally stable environment. Abby has appropriate accommodations, regular meals, educational support, and medical care. More importantly, there's clear evidence of emotional attachment forming between them. Abby is showing signs of increased trust and security, while Mr. Blackwood has demonstrated consistent commitment to her well-being. Asterisk. The Horizons attorney interjected again. Your Honor, while Mr. Blackwood's resources are certainly impressive, we must consider the broader implications of removing a child from the established system based on unverified complaints. Horizons has served thousands of children without incident. Without incident. The Attorney General's representative spoke for the first time, disbelief evident in her tone. Mr. Reynolds, we have documented evidence of systematic neglect, financial misconduct, and failure to report multiple missing children, including Abby Morgan, who lived unsupervised for nearly 2 years, less than 3 miles from your facility. Asterisk Judge Collier raised a hand to halt what was becoming a heated exchange. Let me be clear about something. This hearing is not about the general practices of Horizons Group Home, though I note that those practices are now under separate investigation. This hearing is specifically about determining the best placement for Abby Morgan. Asterisk. She turned to Richard. Mr. Blackwood, I'd like to hear from you now. What motivated you to seek guardianship of Abby, and how do you envision your role in her life moving forward? Asterisk Richard took a deep breath, aware that everything might hinge on his answer. Your Honor, I met Abby by chance on Christmas Eve. I was at a low point in my life, having lost my wife and daughter 5 years earlier. Abby showed me kindness when she had no reason to, offering me shelter and food when she barely had enough for herself. Asterisk. He glanced at Abby, whose expression remained solemn, but whose eyes held steady on his. In getting to know her, I've been constantly amazed by her resilience, her intelligence, and her capacity for generosity. Despite everything she's endured, I can provide her with material security, yes, but she's given me something far more valuable, a reason to look forward to the future again. Asterisk Richard leaned slightly forward, his voice gaining intensity. I'm not seeking temporary guardianship, Your Honor. My intention, if Abby is willing, is to adopt her permanently, to give her not just a house to live in, but a home and a family, to be her father in every way that matters. Asterisk. A hush fell over the room. Abby's eyes widened slightly. They had discussed guardianship extensively, but Richard had been careful not to pressure her with talk of adoption until she felt more secure. Judge Collier studied Richard thoughtfully. That's a significant commitment, Mr. Blackwood. Parenting isn't a part-time endeavor or a charitable project. I understand that completely, Richard replied, and I welcome the responsibility. My priorities have shifted entirely since Abby came into my life. Whatever adjustments are necessary to my work schedule, my living arrangements, my future plans, I'm prepared to make them. Asterisk. The judge turned back to Abby. And how do you feel about that possibility, Abby? Would you want Mr. Blackwood to adopt you eventually? Asterisk Abby hesitated, glancing at Richard before answering. I never thought anyone would want to adopt me, she said quietly. The social workers always said I was too old, too difficult. She straightened her shoulders. But if Richard wants to, then yes, I would like that very much. Asterisk. The simple dignity of her response brought unexpected tears to Richard's eyes. Asterisk. Judge Collier reviewed her notes silently for several minutes while the room remained tense with anticipation. Finally, she looked up. Based on all available evidence, the testimonies presented today, and most importantly the clear bond developing between Mr. Blackwood and Abby Morgan, I am extending the emergency guardianship for a period of 6 months, during which time Mr. Blackwood may petition for adoption if both parties continue to desire that outcome. Asterisk relief washed over Richard in a powerful wave. 6 months. Time to prove himself, to strengthen their bond, to make irrefutable the case that they belong together. However, Judge Collier continued, I am imposing several conditions. First, the weekly visits from Child Protective Services will continue. Second, both Abby and Mr. Blackwood will maintain their counseling sessions with Dr. Lambert. Third, Mr. Blackwood will complete the standard foster parent training program despite his temporary guardian status. Asterisk. She fixed Richard with a penetrating gaze. Are these conditions acceptable to you, Mr. Blackwood? Absolutely, Your Honor, Richard replied without hesitation. Very well, Judge Collier smiled briefly at Abby. Miss Morgan, I wish you all the best in your new home. This court is adjourned. Asterisk. As they left the courthouse, snow was falling again, transforming the city into a winter wonderland. Abby tilted her face upward, catching snowflakes on her cheeks, a smile slowly spreading across her features. We did it, she said, wonderment in her voice. We did, Richard agreed, his own relief making him lightheaded. How do you feel? Asterisk Abby considered the question with her usual thoughtfulness. Happy, she said finally, but also scared. Good scared, though, like when you're about to open a present and you don't know what's inside. Asterisk Richard laughed, understanding perfectly. That's exactly how I feel, too. Asterisk later that evening, after a celebratory dinner prepared by Henderson, who had pretended not to be emotionally affected by the news, but had nevertheless produced Abby's favorite chocolate cake, coincidentally, Richard found Abby sitting in the library, looking at the family photographs he'd recently brought out of storage. Is this Lily? She asked, pointing to a picture of a smiling girl on a swing. Yes, Richard said, sitting beside her. That was her 8th birthday. Asterisk Abby studied the photograph carefully. She looks happy and kind. She was both, Richard confirmed, the memory bringing warmth rather than pain for the first time in years. Asterisk. Abby set down the photograph and looked at Richard directly. In the courtroom you said you wanted to adopt me, to be my father. Did you mean that, or was it just to convince the judge? I meant every word, Richard assured her, but only if that's what you want too. There's no rush to decide. Asterisk Abby was quiet for a moment. I never had a real dad before. I'm not sure I know how to be someone's daughter. I think we'll figure it out together, Richard said gently. That's what families do. Asterisk. The months that followed brought challenges and adjustments as they settled into their new reality. Richard rearranged his work schedule to be home when Abby returned from the private school they'd selected together. He attended parent-teacher conferences, pediatrician appointments, and the foster parent training classes required by the court. He learned to navigate the complexities of raising a child who had experienced significant trauma, recognizing triggers, managing expectations, celebrating small victories. Asterisk Abby, for her part, began to flourish in ways that sometimes took Richard's breath away. Her academic progress was remarkable once her gaps in education were addressed. She made friends cautiously but sincerely. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. Most significantly, she gradually relaxed her vigilance, becoming more willing to ask for help, to express preferences, to trust that her place in Richard's life was secure. Asterisk. There were difficult days too, moments when past trauma surfaced, unexpectedly, when Abby tested boundaries to see if Richard's commitment would waver, when the legal process seemed frustratingly slow. But through it all they remained committed to the promise they'd made to each other. Whatever happened, they would face it together. Asterisk. As the 6-month mark approached, Richard initiated the formal adoption process with Jonathan's guidance. By then, the case against Horizons had resulted in the facility's closure and criminal charges against several administrators, including Mr. Davis and Miss Farber. Judge Matthews had been removed from the bench, pending investigation into judicial misconduct. Most importantly, dozens of children had been relocated to better facilities or placed with properly vetted foster families. The adoption hearing was scheduled, fittingly, for the week before Christmas, almost a year to the day since Richard and Abby had first met on that snowy park bench. On the morning of the hearing, Richard knocked gently on Abby's bedroom door. "Are you ready?" "Almost," she called back. "Can you help me with something?" Richard entered to find Abby struggling with a small jewelry clasp. She held up a silver locket. "Miss Perez helped me get this. I wanted to wear it today, but I can't get it fastened." Richard took the delicate chain, noticing the locket was engraved with intertwining initials, A and R. "It's beautiful," he said, carefully securing it around her neck. "Open it," Abby urged. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Richard and one of Abby, both smiling. "Henderson helped me find a picture of you that wasn't too serious," she explained. "You're always frowning in your official photos." Richard laughed, touched beyond words by the gesture. "It's perfect, and you look very grown up today." Abby smoothed her new dress. She had selected it herself, a sign of her growing confidence. "Do you think the judge will say yes? That I can really be your daughter?" "I believe she will," Richard said. "But remember, no matter what happens in that courtroom, what we have built together is real. Nothing can change that." Abby nodded, her expression solemn but hopeful. "I know, but I still want it to be official." The adoption proceeding was mercifully straightforward. Judge Collier, who had requested to preside over the case herself, reviewed the extensive documentation provided by Miss Winters, Dr. Lambert, and Abby's school. She questioned both Richard and Abby briefly, then smiled broadly. "It gives me great pleasure to approve this adoption," she announced. "From this day forward, Abby Morgan will legally be known as Abby Morgan Blackwood, with all the rights and privileges of a natural-born child of Richard Blackwood." She handed Richard the official decree. "Congratulations to both of you. It's not often I get to witness such a perfect match." Outside the courthouse, snow was falling once again, large flakes drifting lazily from a pearl-grey sky. Richard and Abby stood for a moment on the steps, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. "So that's it?" Abby asked. "I'm really your daughter now? Forever?" "Forever," Richard confirmed, his heart fuller than he had ever imagined possible. Abby considered this momentous fact. "What happens next?" Richard smiled. "Well, Henderson has prepared a celebration dinner, and I believe there might be a few surprises waiting at home." What he didn't mention was the carefully wrapped packages hidden in his study gifts for their first official Christmas as father and daughter, or the project they had undertaken together over the past months, the renovation of Abby's former wooden house into a proper, safe dwelling for a family who needed it, complete with functioning heat, a new roof, and insulated walls. As they walked toward the car, Abby slipped her hand into Richard's, a gesture that had become natural over the months, but still filled him with quiet joy each time. "I was thinking," she said casually, "that maybe we could invite Mrs. Wilson and Mr. Peterson and Miss Chambers for Christmas dinner, since they helped me before when I was alone." "I think that's an excellent idea," Richard agreed. "Family comes in many forms, doesn't it?" Abby nodded seriously. "And sometimes you find it in unexpected places, like on a park bench on Christmas Eve." Richard squeezed her hand gently, marveling at the wisdom of this child who was now, in every way that mattered, his daughter. Exactly like that. 1 year later, Harrison Manor bore little resemblance to the silent, empty mansion Richard had fled on that fateful Christmas Eve. Holiday decorations filled every room, from the massive tree in the foyer to the handmade ornaments Abby had created in art class. The kitchen bustled with activity as Henderson supervised the preparation of a feast that would feed not only their immediate household, but also the guests Abby had insisted on inviting. Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Peterson, Miss Chambers, Dr. Lambert, and even Miss Winters, whose professional oversight had long since evolved into genuine friendship. In the corner of the living room stood a small twisted tree made of dried branches, carefully preserved and decorated with colorful ribbons and tiny lights, a replica of the makeshift Christmas tree from Abby's wooden house, now a treasured tradition. Beside it, photographs told the story of their evolving family. Abby's first day of school, summer vacation at the beach, Richard's birthday celebration, ordinary moments transformed into treasures by the love that infused them. As twilight fell and the first guests began to arrive, Richard found Abby standing by the window, watching the snow fall on the grounds of what was now truly her home. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, joining her. Abby smiled up at him, her face reflecting the child she still was and the remarkable young woman she was becoming. "I was just thinking about how different everything is from last Christmas, how lucky I am." "We both are," Richard corrected gently. Abby nodded, then gave him a mischievous look. "Do you think Henderson would let me help serve dinner? I've been practicing with the fancy plates." "I'm sure he'd be honored," Richard laughed. "You're his star pupil, after all." As Abby hurried off to find the butler, Richard remained by the window for a moment longer, watching as headlights appeared on the driveway, bringing friends to share in their celebration. The mansion that had once echoed with lonely silence now hummed with life and purpose. He thought of Sarah and Lily, still missed but no longer sources of unbearable pain. He thought of the countless children still waiting for homes, for whom his foundation was now developing new programs and advocacy initiatives. He thought of Abby's former house, now occupied by a young mother and her 2 children, the first of what would become a neighborhood revitalization project in Riverdale. Most of all, he thought about the mysterious workings of fate or providence that had led him to that park bench on Christmas Eve, broken, alone, seeking escape, only to find instead the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to be a father again, to make a difference in one child's life, and through that child, to rediscover the meaning of his own. "Dad, Mrs. Wilson is here." Abby called from the hallway. The word Dad still new enough to send a wave of joy through Richard's heart each time he heard it. "Coming," he replied, turning from the window toward the sounds of laughter and conversation filling his home. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a pristine blanket of white, a reminder that even in the coldest seasons, new beginnings were always possible, and that sometimes the most profound miracles began with the simplest acts of kindness. A child offering shelter, a man